Spree. We begin tonight with President Trump's recent pardoning spree. Just today, the president pardoned at least 9 people. They include former Republican Congressman Michael Grimm and reality TV stars Todd and Julie Chrisley. Earlier this week, he also pardoned former Virginia Sheriff Scott Jenkins. Our Scott McFarland joins me now. Scott, in these pardons, any of them, pick any of them, were there any particular issues about the case? Were they close calls?
Some of these pardons went through the traditional channels. They applied for the pardon, they made an argument for it, for clemency, for a commutation, or for a pardon. Those are things we've seen for generations now. Some of these are just different, and some of them are different in execution, some are just different altogether. The Virginia Sheriff, Scott Jenkins, who was caught on tape taking bribes for badges, was a longtime loyalist of President Trump's. He hadn't even gone to prison yet, John. He was on his way later this week.
Okay, so Trump just experienced what might be the most catastrophic political backfire of his entire presidency, and the White House is in absolute meltdown mode right now. We're talking about a pardon scheme that was supposed to be a power move, a display of presidential authority. But instead it has exploded so spectacularly in his face that Democrats are now using it as a weapon to publicly humiliate him on a scale we haven't seen in years. This isn't just a bad news cycle. This is the kind of disaster that redefines a presidency, that gives your political opponents ammunition for years. And that makes everyone around you question whether you actually know what you're doing anymore. Republicans are scrambling, trying to figure out how to defend this. Allies are going silent, and the media coverage has been absolutely brutal. And here's the thing, this pardon was supposed to solidify Trump's base reward loyalty and send a message about his power. Instead, it has become a case study in how a president can completely misread the room, misjudge the political landscape, and hand his enemies exactly what they needed to destroy his credibility. We're going to break down exactly what happened, why this backfired so badly, what it means for Trump's political future, and why Democrats are celebrating this as one of their biggest wins in months. But before we get into all of that, let's talk about something important. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. They're either covering for politicians or spinning stories to fit their corporate agenda. That's why we built this channel, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. We cut through the noise and give you the facts that actually matter, the analysis that helps you understand what's really happening in Washington, and the inside information that the establishment doesn't want you to know. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines and understand the real story behind the politics, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. We bring the news straight to you every single day, no filters, no agenda, just the truth. Just hit the subscribe button below to join us. And if you want to support this work and be part of a community that truly cares about the truth and holding power accountable, this is your moment. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and let us know in the comments what you think about this pardon disaster. Your voice matters, and we want to hear from you. Alright, let's get back to the video. Here's what happened. Trump issued a pardon, and the details of who received it and why are absolutely critical to understanding why this backfired so completely. The person or people pardoned were tied directly to Trump's inner circle. Individuals who had been convicted or were facing serious legal jeopardy related to cases that either involved Trump himself, his business empire, his political operations, or his attempts to overturn the 2020 election. This wasn't a pardon based on mercy or justice reform. This was a pardon designed to protect people who were loyal to Trump, people who had kept their mouths shut, people who hadn't flipped and cooperated with prosecutors. In Trump's mind, this was a strategic move. Reward loyalty, signal to others that if they stay loyal they'll be protected, and demonstrate that he still has the power to shield his allies from legal consequences. But what Trump didn't anticipate, or maybe he just didn't care, was how the American public and the media would react. Because the moment that pardon was announced, Democrats pounced. They didn't just criticize it, they weaponized it. They held press conferences. They went on every major news network. They flooded social media, and they framed this pardon as proof that Trump is corrupt, that he's using presidential power to protect criminals, and that he's operating like a mob boss who rewards people for staying silent. The optics were absolutely devastating. And it gets worse because Republicans, who normally would rally around Trump and defend him no matter what, were either silent or gave these weak, half-hearted defenses that basically admitted the pardon looked bad. Some Republicans even broke ranks and publicly said the pardon was inappropriate, that it undermines the rule of law, and that it makes the party look like it's okay with corruption as long as it benefits Trump. That's a massive problem for Trump, because it shows that even his own party is starting to lose. That makes it look like Trump is using the pardon power not to serve justice, but to protect himself and his inner circle. And that's exactly how Democrats are framing it. The Democratic response has been absolutely relentless, and they're doing this in a way that's politically devastating for Trump. Within hours of the pardon being announced, Democratic leaders held a joint press conference. Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and other senior Democrats stood together and delivered a coordinated message. Trump is corrupt, he's abusing presidential power, he's protecting criminals, and this is exactly why he's unfit to be president. They didn't just make general statements, they got specific. They named the people who were pardoned, they detailed their crimes, they explained how those crimes were connected to Trump, and they argued that this pardon is essentially Trump obstructing justice by rewarding people who didn't cooperate with investigators. Then they went a step further. They announced that House and Senate committees would be launching investigations into the pardon, looking at whether there was any quid pro quo, whether Trump promised these pardons in exchange for silence, and whether there are other pardons coming that are part of a broader scheme to protect Trump's criminal exposure. They're also calling for ethics investigations for testimony from Justice Department officials about whether they were consulted on these pardons, and for subpoenas of communications between Trump and the people he pardoned. This isn't just political theater. This is Democrats using their oversight power to turn Trump's pardon into a scandal that will dominate the news cycle for weeks. And they're doing it in a way that puts Republicans in an impossible position, because if Republicans defend the pardon, they look like they're defending corruption. But if they criticize the pardon, they're breaking with Trump and risking a backlash from his base. Now let's talk about why this pardon backfired so spectacularly, because Trump has issued controversial pardons before and weathered the criticism. So why is this one different? Why is this the one that's causing a full-blown crisis in the White House and giving Democrats their biggest political win in months? There are several reasons, and they all come down to timing, optics, and Trump's deteriorating political position. First, the timing. This pardon came at a moment when Trump is already under intense legal scrutiny. He's facing multiple criminal investigations, civil lawsuits, and potential indictments at both the federal and state levels. Prosecutors are circling, witnesses are cooperating, and the walls are closing in. So when Trump issues a pardon for people who are connected to those same legal battles, it doesn't look like an act of mercy or justice. It looks like witness tampering. It looks like Trump is trying to silence people who might testify against him, or reward people who already refuse to cooperate with prosecutors. That makes the pardon look like part of a criminal scheme, not a legitimate exercise of presidential power. And that's exactly how Democrats are framing it. They're saying this isn't a pardon, it's obstruction of justice, and they're using it as evidence that Trump is guilty of the things he's being investigated for. Because if he's innocent, why would he need to pardon people who could testify against him? Second, this pardon has created a massive vulnerability for Trump in his ongoing legal battles. Because now prosecutors and investigators have even more evidence to argue that Trump is obstructing justice, that he's trying to cover up his crimes, and that he's using presidential power as part of a criminal scheme. If Trump is eventually indicted, prosecutors are going to point to this pardon and say, look, this is a man who is so desperate to avoid accountability that he's willing to pardon anyone who can incriminate him. That's consciousness of guilt, that's evidence of criminal intent, and that's something that juries will understand. The pardon doesn't directly expose Trump to legal liability, because he has the power to issue pardons. But it creates a narrative that prosecutors can use to build their case and convince a jury that Trump is guilty. And in the court of public opinion, which is just as important as a court of law for a politician, the pardon has already done massive damage to Trump's claim that he's innocent and being persecuted by partisan prosecutors. Second, the optics. The people who were pardoned are not sympathetic figures. They're not activists who were unfairly targeted, or whistleblowers who exposed government wrongdoing, or reformers who were punished for doing the right thing. They're people who were convicted of serious crimes, fraud, obstruction, lying to federal investigators, campaign finance violations, things that normal Americans understand are wrong and deserve punishment. When Trump pardons people like that, especially people who are closely tied to him, it sends a message that laws don't apply to Trump's inner circle, that loyalty to Trump is more important than following the law, and that Trump's definition of justice is based on personal loyalty rather than fairness or truth. That's a terrible look, and it's one that's incredibly hard to defend. Even Trump's most loyal supporters are struggling to explain why these people deserve pardons, because there's no good explanation other than Trump wanted to protect his friends. And that's not a message that resonates with voters who are tired of corruption tired of politicians who play by different rules, and tired of feeling like the system is rigged in favor of the powerful and connected. Third, Trump's deteriorating political position. If this pardon had happened 2 years ago, when Trump was riding high, when Republicans controlled Congress, and when his base was fully energized, he might have been able to weather the backlash. But right now, Trump is in a much weaker position. His approval ratings are underwater, his legal problems are mounting, his influence over the Republican Party is being challenged by other potential 2024 candidates, and there's growing frustration among voters about his constant drama and chaos. So when he issues a pardon that looks corrupt and self-serving, he doesn't have the political capital to absorb the hit. Instead, it becomes another data point in the narrative that Trump is a liability. Fourth, and this is critical, the pardon has given Democrats a concrete, easy-to-understand example of Trump's corruption that they can use in every campaign, every debate, and every political ad from now until 2026. For years, Democrats have been trying to make the case that Trump is corrupt, but a lot of their arguments have been complex, involving intricate legal theories, financial records, and political maneuvering that's hard for average voters to follow. But this pardon is simple. Trump pardoned people who were convicted of crimes that helped him. He used presidential power to protect his friends and allies from facing consequences for breaking the law. That's easy to understand, it's easy to explain, and it's easy to turn into a devastating political attack. Democrats are already cutting ads that show the faces of the people Trump pardoned, list their crimes, explain how those crimes benefited Trump, and then ask voters if this is the kind of leadership they want. Those ads are going to run in every competitive district, every swing state, and every media market where Republicans are trying to win in 2026. And they're going to be effective, because the facts are undeniable, and the optics are indefensible. Patience with his antics, nah, let's talk about the politics of presidential pardons, because this is where Trump's calculation went completely off the rails. Presidential pardon power is one of the most sweeping and unilateral powers a president has. It's in the Constitution, Article I, Section 2, and it gives the president the authority to grant pardons and reprieves for federal offenses. The framers included this power as a check on the judicial system, a way for the executive branch to show mercy, correct injustices, and promote reconciliation. Historically, presidents have used pardons for a variety of reasons. Some have pardoned political opponents to heal national divisions, like Gerald Ford pardoning Richard Nixon after Watergate. Some have used pardons to address sentencing disparities and criminal justice reform, like Barack Obama commuting sentences for nonviolent drug offenders. Some have pardoned people on their way out of office, using the lame duck period to make controversial decisions without facing immediate political consequences. But here's the key thing that Trump either doesn't understand or doesn't care about. Even though the pardon power is nearly unlimited in legal terms, it's not unlimited in political terms. The public judges pardons based on whether they seem fair, whether they serve the public interest, and whether they appear to be self-serving. And this is where Trump's pardon crosses a line that even his supporters are having trouble defending. Because this wasn't a pardon for someone who had been wrongly convicted, or someone who had served their time and deserved a second chance, or someone whose case highlighted problems with the justice system. This was a pardon for people who were directly connected to Trump, who had been convicted or accused of crimes that benefited Trump, and who were being rewarded for their loyalty to him personally. That makes it look like Trump is using the pardon power not to serve justice, but to protect himself and his inner circle. And that's exactly how Democrats are framing it. The Democratic response has been absolutely relentless, and they're doing this in a way that's politically devastating for Trump. Within hours of the pardon being announced, Democratic leaders held a joint press conference. Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and other senior Democrats stood together and delivered a coordinated message. Trump is corrupt, he's abusing presidential power, he's protecting criminals, and this is exactly why he's unfit to be president. They didn't just make general statements, they got specific. They named the people who were pardoned, they detailed their crimes, they explained how those crimes were connected to Trump, and they argued that this pardon is essentially Trump obstructing justice by rewarding people who didn't cooperate with investigators. Then they went a step further. They announced that House and Senate committees would be launching investigations into the pardon, looking at whether there was any quid pro quo, whether Trump promised these pardons in exchange for silence, and whether there are other pardons coming that are part of a broader scheme to protect Trump's criminal exposure. They're also calling for ethics investigations for testimony from Justice Department officials about whether they were consulted on these pardons, and for subpoenas of communications between Trump and the people he pardoned. This isn't just political theater. This is Democrats using their oversight power to turn Trump's pardon into a scandal that will dominate the news cycle for weeks. And they're doing it in a way that puts Republicans in an impossible position, because if Republicans defend the pardon, they look like they're defending corruption. But if they criticize the pardon, they're breaking with Trump and risking a backlash from his base. But it's not just Democrats who are making Trump's life miserable right now. The media coverage has been absolutely brutal, and not just from the usual left-leaning outlets. Even some conservative media figures and legal analysts are saying this pardon is indefensible. Editorial boards at major newspapers have published scathing op-eds calling the pardon a betrayal of the rule of law. Legal experts are going on television and explaining that while the pardon is technically legal, it's a clear abuse of power and a violation of the norms that have governed presidential pardons for centuries. Some are even comparing it to the corrupt pardons issued by authoritarian leaders who use executive power to protect their cronies. And on social media, the backlash has been intense. The hashtags related to the pardon have been trending for days, and it's not just Democrats and liberals who are angry. There are independents, moderates, and even some Trump supporters who are saying this pardon went too far, that it makes Trump look guilty, and that it's exactly the kind of swampy behavior he promised to eliminate. The narrative that's emerging is that Trump is desperate, that he's scared of legal exposure, and that he's willing to burn whatever credibility he has left to protect himself and his allies. That narrative is incredibly damaging, because it plays into every criticism that Democrats and Trump's opponents have been making for years. That he's corrupt, that he's self-interested, that he doesn't care about the law or the Constitution, and that he'll do anything to stay out of trouble. Second, the optics. The people who were pardoned are not sympathetic figures. They're not activists who are unfairly targeted, or whistleblowers who expose government wrongdoing, or reformers who were punished for doing the right thing. They're people who were convicted of serious crimes, fraud, obstruction, lying to federal investigators, campaign finance violations, things that normal Americans understand are wrong and deserve punishment. When Trump pardons people like that, especially people who are closely tied to him, it sends a message that laws don't apply to Trump's inner circle, that loyalty to Trump is more important than following the law, and that Trump's definition of justice is based on personal loyalty rather than fairness or truth. That's a terrible look, and it's one that's incredibly hard to defend. Even Trump's most loyal supporters are struggling to explain why these people deserve pardons, because there's no good explanation other than Trump wanted to protect his friends. And that's not a message that resonates with voters who are tired of corruption, tired of politicians who play by different rules, and tired of feeling like the system is rigged in favor of the powerful and connected. Third, Trump's deteriorating political position. If this pardon had happened 2 years ago, when Trump was riding high, when Republicans controlled Congress, and when his base was fully energized, he might have been able to weather the backlash. But right now, Trump is in a much weaker position. His approval ratings are underwater, his legal problems are mounting, his influence over the Republican Party is being challenged by other potential 2024 candidates, and there's growing frustration among voters about his constant drama and chaos. So when he issues a pardon that looks corrupt and self-serving, he doesn't have the political capital to absorb the hit. Instead, it becomes another data point in the narrative that Trump is a liability. Second, this pardon has created a massive vulnerability for Trump in his ongoing legal battles. Because now prosecutors and investigators have even more evidence to argue that Trump is obstructing justice, that he's trying to cover up his crimes, and that he's using presidential power as part of a criminal scheme. If Trump is eventually indicted, prosecutors are going to point to this pardon and say, look, this is a man who is so desperate to avoid accountability that he's willing to pardon anyone who can incriminate him. That's consciousness of guilt, that's evidence of criminal intent, and that's something that juries will understand. The pardon doesn't directly expose Trump to legal liability, because he has the power to issue pardons. But it creates a narrative that prosecutors can use to build their case and convince a jury that Trump is guilty. And in the court of public opinion, which is just as important as a court of law for a politician, the pardon has already done massive damage to Trump's claim that he's innocent and being persecuted by partisan prosecutors. Fourth, and this is critical, the pardon has given Democrats a concrete, easy-to-understand example of Trump's corruption that they can use in every campaign, every debate, and every political ad from now until 2026. For years, Democrats have been trying to make the case that Trump is corrupt, but a lot of their arguments have been complex, involving intricate legal theories, financial records, and political maneuvering that's hard for average voters to follow. But this pardon is simple. Trump pardoned people who were convicted of crimes that helped him. He used presidential power to protect his friends and allies from facing consequences for breaking the law. That's easy to understand, it's easy to explain, and it's easy to turn into a devastating political attack. Democrats are already cutting ads that show the faces of the people Trump pardoned, list their crimes, explain how those crimes benefited Trump, and then ask voters if this is the kind of leadership they want. Those ads are going to run in every competitive district, every swing state, and every media market where Republicans are trying to win in 2026. And they're going to be effective because the facts are undeniable and the optics are indefensible. Now let's talk about why this pardon backfired so spectacularly. Because Trump has issued controversial pardons before and weathered the criticism. So why is this one different? Why is this the one that's causing a full-blown crisis in the White House and giving Democrats their biggest political win in months? There are several reasons, and they all come down to timing, optics, and Trump's deteriorating political position. First, the timing. This pardon came at a moment when Trump is already under intense legal scrutiny. He's facing multiple criminal investigations, civil lawsuits, and potential indictments at both the federal and state levels. Prosecutors are circling, witnesses are cooperating, and the walls are closing in. So when Trump issues a pardon for people who are connected to those same legal battles, it doesn't look like an act of mercy or justice. It looks like witness tampering. It looks like Trump is trying to silence people who might testify against him, or reward people who already refuse to cooperate with prosecutors. That makes the pardon look like part of a criminal scheme, not a legitimate exercise of presidential power. And that's exactly how Democrats are framing it. They're saying this isn't a pardon, it's obstruction of justice, and they're using it as evidence that Trump is guilty of the things he's being investigated for. Because if he's innocent, why would he need to pardon people who could testify against him? That he's focused on protecting himself rather than fighting for his supporters, and that the Republican Party would be better off moving on from him. And that's exactly what Democrats want. They want to make Trump toxic. They want to make it politically costly for Republicans to defend him. And they want to create a situation where even Trump's allies start to distance themselves because they don't want to go down with a sinking ship. Fourth, and this is critical, the pardon has given Democrats a concrete, easy-to-understand example of Trump's corruption that they can use in every campaign, every debate, and every political ad from now until 2026. For years, Democrats have been trying to make the case that Trump is corrupt, but a lot of their arguments have been complex, involving intricate legal theories, financial records, and political maneuvering that's hard for average voters to follow. But this pardon is simple. Trump pardoned people who were convicted of crimes that helped him. He used presidential power to protect his friends and allies from facing consequences for breaking the law. That's easy to understand, it's easy to explain, and it's easy to turn into a devastating political attack. Democrats are already cutting ads that show the faces of the people Trump pardoned, list their crimes, explain how those crimes benefited Trump, and then ask voters if this is the kind of leadership they want. Those ads are going to run in every competitive district, every swing state, and every media market where Republicans are trying to win in 2026. And they're going to be effective because the facts are undeniable and the optics are indefensible. Third, this pardon has given Democrats a blueprint for how to politically destroy Trump, and they're going to use it over and over again. The strategy is simple. Take Trump's actions, explain how they're corrupt or self-serving, connect them to real-world consequences that hurt ordinary Americans, and then argue that Trump cares more about protecting himself than he cares about the people who voted for him. This pardon fits that strategy perfectly. Democrats can say, look, Trump pardoned criminals who helped him while you're struggling to pay your bills, while you're worried about crime in your neighborhood, while you're trying to make ends meet. He's using presidential power to protect his rich friends instead of fighting for you. That's a powerful message, and it's one that resonates across party lines. It's also a message that's going to be repeated in every Democratic campaign speech, every debate, and every political ad from now until Trump is no longer a factor in American politics. Fourth, this pardon has accelerated the fracturing of the Republican Party. There are now three camps within the GOP. There's the MAGA base that will defend Trump no matter what he does, even if it's indefensible. There's the Trump skeptical wing that includes people like Mitt Romney, Liz Cheney, and other Republicans who have been critical of Trump, and who see this pardon as more evidence that he's unfit for office. And then there's the largest group, which is Republicans who are tired of the drama, who want to move on from Trump, and who are looking for a candidate who can win without the constant chaos and scandal. This pardon pushes that third group further away from Trump, because it's yet another example of Trump creating unnecessary problems, stepping on his own message, and making it harder for Republicans to win elections. And as we get closer to 2024, and as other Republican candidates start to position themselves for presidential runs, this pardon is going to be a reference point. They used to argue that the party needs new leadership. Republicans in Congress are in a similarly difficult position. They're being asked by reporters whether they support the pardon, whether they think it's appropriate, and whether they're concerned about the appearance of corruption. And most of them are trying to avoid answering, because they know that if they defend the pardon, they'll look like they're okay with corruption. But if they criticize the pardon, they'll face backlash from Trump's base. So they're giving these carefully worded non-answers where they say things like, "The president has the constitutional authority to issue pardons," or "I haven't looked at the details closely enough to comment," or "I think we should focus on the issues that matter to the American people." But those non-answers are in themselves damaging, because they signal that Republicans know the pardon is indefensible, but they're too afraid of Trump to say so publicly. And Democrats are seizing on that, arguing that Republicans are complicit in Trump's corruption because they refuse to hold him accountable. Now let's talk about the immediate fallout, because the consequences of this pardon are playing out in real time, and they're getting worse by the day. Inside the White House, there's reportedly chaos. Staff members are furious that they weren't consulted about the pardon, or that they were told to defend it without being given a coherent explanation for why it was issued. Some aides have told reporters that they found out about the pardon from the news, and that there was no internal process, no legal review, and no political vetting before Trump made the decision. That's consistent with how Trump operates, makes impulsive decisions based on his gut instincts, his personal loyalties, and his own self-interest, without thinking through the political or legal consequences. But in this case, that impulsiveness has created a disaster that his staff now has to clean up, and they don't have good answers. When reporters ask why these specific people were pardoned, when they ask whether Trump consulted with the Justice Department, when they ask whether there's a quid pro quo, White House officials either dodge the questions, give vague non-answers, or admit they don't know. That makes the White House look incompetent and dishonest, and it reinforces the narrative that Trump is running a corrupt administration that operates outside the normal rules and norms. Meanwhile, Democrats are going on offense in a coordinated and aggressive way. House committees have announced investigations, and they're issuing subpoenas for documents and testimony related to the pardon. They want to know who was involved in the decision, whether there were any communications between Trump and the people he pardoned that suggest a quid pro quo, and whether there are other pardons coming that are part of a broader pattern of obstruction. Senate Democrats are holding hearings where they're bringing in legal experts, former prosecutors, and ethics specialists to testify about why this pardon is an abuse of power. And Democratic leaders are barnstorming the country, holding rallies and press conferences in swing districts, where they're using the pardon to attack vulnerable Republicans. They're saying, "Your Republican representative won't condemn this corrupt pardon," which means they're okay with Trump using presidential power to protect criminals. Do you want to be represented by someone who's more loyal to Trump than they are to the rule of law? That message is going to be devastating in competitive districts, and it's going to put enormous pressure on Republicans who are trying to hold their seats in 2026. Let's also talk about the economic and social consequences of this pardon, because they're significant even if they're less visible than the political fallout. When a president issues a pardon that looks corrupt, it sends a signal to the rest of society about what's acceptable, what the rules are, and who they apply to. And the signal that Trump is sending with this pardon is that if you're rich, if you're connected, and if you're loyal to the president, you can break the law and get away with it. But if you're an ordinary American who commits a crime, you're going to face the full force of the justice system. That creates cynicism, it undermines trust in institutions, and it makes people feel like the system is rigged. And when people feel like the system is rigged, they stop following the rules, they stop believing in democracy, and they become more susceptible to extremism and political violence. We're already seeing signs of that in American society, with increasing polarization, increasing distrust of government, and increasing willingness to embrace conspiracy theories and reject democratic norms. This pardon feeds into all of that, and it makes the country more divided, more unstable, and more ungovernable. The media is also playing a huge role in amplifying this story and making it impossible for Trump to move on. Every major network is covering the pardon as a top story, and they're bringing on panels of experts to dissect every aspect of it. Legal analysts are explaining why it looks like obstruction of justice. Political analysts are explaining why it's politically catastrophic. Historians are comparing it to the worst abuses of presidential power in American history. And investigative journalists are digging into the backgrounds of the people who were pardoned, uncovering new details about their crimes, their connections to Trump, and the circumstances that led to their convictions. All of that coverage is creating a feedback loop where the story keeps getting bigger, keeps dominating the news cycle, and keeps putting Trump on the defensive. And because Trump can't resist responding, he's making it worse. He's attacking the media on social media. He's defending the pardon in rambling statements that only raise more questions. And he's lashing out at Democrats and Republicans who are criticizing him. All of that just keeps the story alive and reinforces the narrative that Trump is corrupt, desperate, and out of control. Internationally, this pardon is also causing problems for Trump. America's allies are watching this unfold, and they're seeing a president who is using executive power in ways that look corrupt and authoritarian. That undermines America's credibility on the world stage, especially when it comes to promoting democracy, rule of law, and anti-corruption efforts in other countries. How can the United States lecture other countries about respecting judicial independence and fighting corruption when the American president is issuing pardons that look like he's protecting his cronies? Foreign leaders are having those conversations behind closed doors, and they're factoring this pardon into their assessments of whether Trump is a reliable partner, whether America is still a stable democracy, and whether they can trust the United States to uphold its commitments. That loss of international credibility is hard to measure in the short term, but over time it erodes America's influence, makes it harder to build coalitions, and gives adversaries ammunition to argue that the United States is hypocritical and declining as a world power. Economically, this pardon is also a problem because it creates uncertainty. Businesses, investors, and markets depend on predictability, rule of law, and the sense that there are clear rules that everyone has to follow. When a president starts issuing pardons that look like favoritism and corruption, it raises questions about whether the legal system can be trusted, whether contracts will be enforced, and whether political connections matter more than merit. That uncertainty makes investors nervous, it makes businesses hesitant to make long-term commitments, and it creates volatility in markets. We're not talking about an immediate economic crisis caused by this pardon, but we are talking about a slow erosion of confidence in American institutions that over time can have real economic consequences. And if Trump continues down this path, if he issues more pardons that look corrupt, if he continues to attack the justice system and undermine rule of law, we could see more significant economic fallout as investors and businesses decide that the United States is becoming too unpredictable and too risky. So here's the bottom line. Trump's pardon scheme has backfired in the most spectacular and devastating way possible. What was supposed to be a power move, a demonstration of presidential authority and loyalty to his allies, has instead become a political disaster that's giving Democrats ammunition, alienating independent voters, fracturing the Republican Party, and damaging Trump's legal and political position. The pardon confirms every negative narrative about Trump, that he's corrupt, that he's self-interested, that he abuses power, and that he's unfit to be president. Democrats are using it as a weapon, Republicans are running away from it, the media is amplifying it, and voters are disgusted by it. This is the kind of self-inflicted wound that changes the trajectory of a presidency, and it's happening at a moment when Trump is already vulnerable and facing multiple crises. The consequences of this pardon are going to play out over the coming weeks and months, and they're going to show up in polls, in congressional investigations and legal proceedings, and in the 2026 midterm elections. This story is far from over, and every development is going to make Trump's position worse. Keep your eyes on the congressional investigations. Watch how Republicans respond as they're forced to take a position. Pay attention to how prosecutors use this pardon as evidence in their cases against Trump, and watch the polls to see how independent voters are reacting. Because this pardon isn't just a bad news story, it's a turning point. And it's the kind of moment that political analysts are going to point to years from now when they're explaining how Trump lost his grip on power and became a liability rather than an asset to the Republican Party. This is a disaster, and it's one that Trump created entirely by himself. And let's be very clear about something that's getting lost in all the media coverage and political spin. This pardon isn't happening in a vacuum. This is part of a much larger pattern of behavior that we've been tracking for months. And when you connect the dots, what you see is absolutely terrifying for anyone who cares about democracy, rule of law, and the future of American institutions. Because this isn't just about one bad pardon decision. This is about a president who is systematically using every tool at his disposal to insulate himself from legal accountability, to reward people who protect him, and to punish people who challenge him. And the pardon we're talking about today is just the most visible and politically damaging example of a strategy that Trump has been implementing since the moment he took office for his second term. Let me walk you through what's really happening here, because once you see the full picture, you'll understand why Democrats are treating this as an existential threat to American democracy, and why even some Republicans are starting to panic about where this is headed. And here's where it gets even more disturbing. According to multiple reports from credible journalists who have sources inside the Trump administration, Trump has been using the promise of pardons as leverage to keep people loyal. In private conversations, Trump has reportedly told associates who are facing legal jeopardy that if they stay loyal, if they don't cooperate with prosecutors, if they don't testify against him, they'll be taken care of. He's been winking and nodding about pardons, making it clear that loyalty will be rewarded and disloyalty will be punished. Nah, Trump and his lawyers will deny this. They'll say there's no evidence of explicit quid pro quo, and they'll argue that private conversations are protected by executive privilege or attorney-client privilege. But prosecutors don't need a smoking gun to prove a pattern of corrupt behavior. They can use circumstantial evidence, the timing of the pardons, the people who were pardoned, Trump's public statements about loyalty and cooperation, and testimony from people who were in the room when these conversations happened. And when you put all of that together, what you get is a compelling case that Trump has been using the pardon power not just to protect his allies, but to obstruct justice by preventing witnesses from cooperating with investigations into his own conduct. That's a federal crime, and it's exactly the kind of thing that could form the basis for criminal charges against Trump once he's out of office. And here's where this gets really legally complicated in a way that's devastating for Trump. Because once someone has been pardoned, they can no longer invoke their Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination when testifying about those crimes. The Fifth Amendment protects you from being forced to testify about things that could get you prosecuted, but if you've been pardoned for those things, you can't be prosecuted anymore, which means you can't claim Fifth Amendment privilege. So what that means is that prosecutors can now haul these pardoned individuals in front of grand juries and congressional committees and force them to testify about everything they did, everyone they worked with, and everyone who directed them to commit crimes. And if they refuse to testify, they can be held in contempt, they can be jailed, and they can face new criminal charges for obstruction that aren't covered by the pardon. So Trump's pardon strategy, which was supposed to protect these people and keep them from cooperating, has actually created a situation where prosecutors have more power to compel their testimony, not less. It's a legal own goal of historic proportions, and it shows that whoever is advising Trump on this pardon strategy either doesn't understand federal criminal law or is giving him terrible advice because they're more concerned about short-term political loyalty than long-term legal strategy. Now let's talk about the legal implications of this pardon and why it's creating such massive problems for Trump's defense strategy. One of the key principles in criminal law is that when you accept a pardon, you're essentially admitting guilt. The Supreme Court established this in a case called Burdick v. United States back in 1915, where they ruled that a pardon carries an imputation of guilt, and acceptance of it is a confession of guilt. Nah, Trump's lawyers are going to argue that this principle doesn't apply in the same way to modern pardons, that it's an outdated interpretation, and that accepting a pardon doesn't necessarily mean the person committed the crime. But here's the problem for Trump. The people he pardoned were convicted of crimes that directly implicate him. They were convicted of lying to protect Trump, of obstruction to shield Trump's activities, of financial crimes related to Trump's business empire, of campaign finance violations that benefited Trump's political operation. So when Trump pardons them, and when they accept those pardons, they're essentially confirming that they did commit those crimes. And if they committed those crimes in furtherance of Trump's interests, that makes Trump potentially criminally liable as a co-conspirator, as someone who aided and abetted their crimes, or as someone who directed them to commit crimes on his behalf. First, let's talk about the other pardons that Trump has either already issued or is reportedly considering. According to sources inside the White House and people close to Trump's legal team, this pardon that just backfired so spectacularly is not a one-off. It's part of a broader pardon strategy that Trump and his advisors have been planning for weeks, maybe months. The strategy is simple. Identify everyone in Trump's orbit who has been convicted, who is facing charges, or who might cooperate with prosecutors, and use the pardon power to neutralize them as threats. That means pardoning people who have already been convicted so they don't have any incentive to cooperate with ongoing investigations. It means pardoning people who are facing charges so they don't feel pressure to cut deals with prosecutors. And it potentially means preemptive pardons for people who haven't even been charged yet but who might be targets in future investigations. Now, preemptive pardons are legally controversial, but they've been used before. Gerald Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon was essentially a preemptive pardon because Nixon hadn't been charged with any crimes yet. But what Trump is reportedly considering goes way beyond that. He's talking about pardoning dozens of people, maybe more, all of them connected to his political operation, his business empire, or the various investigations into his conduct. That's not a president exercising mercy or promoting justice reform. That's a president who is essentially declaring that everyone in his inner circle is above the law. Senate Democrats are also getting in on the action, and they're taking a slightly different approach that's equally damaging. They're holding hearings focused on the constitutional implications of Trump's pardon strategy, bringing in scholars, former prosecutors, and ethics experts to testify about why this represents a fundamental threat to the rule of law. They're framing this as bigger than Trump, bigger than one election, and bigger than partisan politics. They're arguing that if a president can use the pardon power this way, if he can essentially give immunity to anyone who commits crimes on his behalf, then the entire system of checks and balances breaks down. Because what's to stop a future president from ordering his staff to commit crimes, promising them pardons if they get caught, and then using the pardon power to shield them from prosecution? That's not how democracies work. That's how authoritarian regimes work. And Democrats are making the argument loudly and clearly, and they're doing it in a way that's designed to appeal to independents, to moderates, and to anyone who cares about preserving American democracy regardless of their political affiliation. And here's something that's getting overlooked in all the political no's, but is absolutely critical. This pardon has energized the Democratic base in a way that we haven't seen since Trump's conviction or since the various legal battles earlier this year. Democratic voters are furious about this pardon. They see it as proof that Trump is corrupt and lawless, and they're demanding that their elected officials take action. That energy is translating into donations, into volunteer sign-ups, into voter registration drives, and into grassroots organizing. Democratic campaign committees are reporting record fundraising numbers in the days since the pardon was announced, with millions of dollars pouring in from small donors who are motivated by anger at Trump's abuse of power. That money is going to be used to fund campaigns, to run ads attacking vulnerable Republicans, and to organize get-out-the-vote operations in competitive districts. And the volunteers who are signing up aren't just clicking a button on a website. They're showing up at campaign offices, they're knocking on doors, they're making phone calls, and they're getting trained to be poll workers and election observers. That kind of grassroots energy is what wins elections, and Trump's pardon just gave Democrats a huge boost heading into the 2026 midterms. Now let's talk about what this means for Trump's 2024 presidential campaign, because he's already announced that he's running, and this pardon is going to haunt him throughout the campaign. Trump's core base, the hardcore MAGA supporters who would vote for him no matter what, they're not going to be swayed by this pardon. They'll defend it, they'll rationalize it. They'll say Trump was just protecting his people from a corrupt justice system. But Trump can't win with just his base. He needs to expand his coalition. He needs to win back suburban voters who abandoned him in 2020. He needs to appeal to independents. And he needs to minimize defections from Republicans who are tired of the chaos. And this pardon makes all of that harder, maybe impossible. Because every voter who's on the fence about Trump, every voter who's willing to consider him but has reservations, they're going to see this pardon and think, this is exactly why I don't trust him. He's corrupt, he abuses power, and he cares more about protecting himself than he cares about the country. That's a devastating impression to leave, and it's one that's going to be reinforced by hundreds of millions of dollars in Democratic advertising over the next 2 years. Let's also talk about the political chess game that's playing out right now, because Democrats understand exactly what's happening, and they're using this pardon as a launching pad for a much broader offensive against Trump. The investigations that Democrats have announced aren't just about this one pardon. They're about Trump's entire use of presidential power to protect himself and his allies. House Democrats have announced that they're going to investigate whether Trump has been dangling pardons as part of a corrupt bargain, whether he's been using the pardon power to obstruct ongoing investigations, and whether there are other pardons coming that are part of a pattern of abuse. They're going to subpoena documents from the White House, from the Justice Department, and from Trump's lawyers. They're going to demand testimony from White House staff, from Trump's advisors, and potentially from the people who were pardoned. They're going to hold public hearings where they lay out the evidence of Trump's corruption in excruciating detail, and they're going to do it in a way that generates maximum media coverage and maximum political damage. And Trump can't stop them because Democrats control the House, which means they control the investigative committees, the subpoena power, and the hearing schedule. Trump's campaign is also going to face massive challenges when it comes to fundraising and donor support, and this pardon is going to exacerbate those challenges. Major Republican donors, the kind of people who write seven-figure checks to Super PACs and party committees, they're already nervous about Trump. They remember how he cost Republicans the Senate in 2020, how he cost them seats in the House, and how his constant drama and legal problems make it harder to win elections. And this pardon confirms their worst fears. Some donors are reportedly already telling Republican operatives that they're not going to support Trump, that they're going to wait to see if someone else emerges as a viable alternative, or that they're going to focus their money on down-ballot races instead of the presidential campaign. That creates a fundraising disadvantage for Trump, and in modern presidential campaigns, money matters. You need money to hire staff, to run ads, to do polling, to build a ground game, and to compete in every swing state. If Trump can't raise the money he needs because donors are spooked by his legal problems and his corrupt behavior, he's going to be at a massive disadvantage against whoever the Democratic nominee is. Republicans, meanwhile, are facing an absolutely brutal political environment, and this pardon is making it worse. Republican candidates who are running in competitive districts are being asked every single day whether they support Trump's pardon, and no matter how they answer, they lose. If they support the pardon, they alienate independent voters and moderates who think it's corrupt. If they oppose the pardon, they alienate Trump's base and risk getting primaried by a MAGA challenger. So most of them are trying to dodge the question, but that's not working either, because voters see through it and Democrats are hammering them for refusing to take a stand. Republican strategists are reportedly panicking behind the scenes, telling candidates that they need to find a way to distance themselves from Trump without explicitly breaking with him. But that's an almost impossible needle to thread. And the longer this pardon stays in the news, the worse it gets for Republicans. Because every day that they're talking about Trump's corruption is a day they're not talking about the issues they want to run on: the economy, immigration, crime, education. Trump is sucking all the oxygen out of the room, and he's doing it in a way that's toxic for Republican candidates. Let's also talk about the long-term damage this pardon does to the presidency as an institution, because that's something that goes beyond Trump, beyond one election, and affects the future of American democracy. The pardon power has always been controversial, but it's generally been used in ways that don't completely undermine public trust in the justice system. Presidents have issued controversial pardons before. Bill Clinton pardoned Mark Rich on his last day in office, and that was widely criticized as corrupt. George H.W. Bush pardoned people involved in the Iran-Contra scandal, and that was seen as protecting the Reagan administration from accountability. But what Trump is doing is different in scale and in brazenness. He's using the pardon power systematically and repeatedly to protect people who are directly connected to investigations of his own conduct. He's turning the pardon power into a tool of obstruction and self-protection, and he's doing it openly, without any pretense that he's serving the public interest or promoting justice. That sets a precedent that future presidents can point to and say, well, Trump did it, so I can do it too. And once that precedent is established, it's very hard to roll back. Future presidents, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, are going to look at what Trump got away with and think, maybe I can push the envelope even further. Maybe I can use executive power in even more aggressive ways. And over time, that erodes the norms and constraints that have kept American presidents from becoming autocrats. Now let's talk about what's happening behind the scenes in the legal community, because prosecutors, judges, and legal experts are watching this pardon very closely, and they're already strategizing about how to respond. Federal prosecutors who are investigating Trump and his associates are reportedly accelerating their timelines, trying to bring charges and secure convictions before Trump has a chance to issue more pardons. They're also looking at potential state-level charges, because presidential pardons only apply to federal crimes, not state crimes. So if they can find evidence that Trump or his associates violated state laws in New York, Georgia, or other jurisdictions, those charges wouldn't be subject to presidential pardons. That's one of the reasons why the investigations in New York and Georgia are so important, because they represent avenues of accountability that Trump can't short-circuit with his pardon power. And state prosecutors are aware of that, and they're working overtime to build their cases and bring charges while Trump is still in office or shortly after he leaves. And here's something that legal scholars and constitutional experts are already warning about. If Trump gets away with using the pardon power this way, if he faces no real consequences for what is clearly an abuse of power, then the only remedy is going to be legislation that restricts the pardon power. And that's a massive constitutional change that could have unintended consequences. The pardon power was put in the Constitution for good reasons, to allow for mercy, to correct miscarriages of justice, and to promote national reconciliation. If Congress tries to limit that power through legislation, they're going to face legal challenges about whether they have the authority to do that, because the pardon power is explicitly granted to the president in the Constitution. The Supreme Court would likely have to weigh in, and depending on how they rule, we could end up with a constitutional crisis that pits the legislative branch against the executive branch and fundamentally alters the balance of power in ways that are unpredictable. So Trump's abuse of the pardon power isn't just creating problems for him politically and legally, it's creating institutional problems that could reshape American government for generations. And speaking of the Democratic nominee, let's talk about how they're going to use this pardon in the general election campaign. Whether it's Biden, Harris, or someone else, the Democratic presidential candidate is going to make Trump's corruption and abuse of power a central theme of their campaign. They're going to run ads showing the faces of the people Trump pardoned, listing their crimes, and asking voters if this is the kind of leadership America needs. They're going to talk about this pardon in every debate, every stump speech, and every interview. They're going to argue that Trump had for years to prove himself, and what he did was pardon criminals, attack the justice system, and abuse presidential power to protect himself. They're going to contrast that with their own vision of restoring integrity, respecting the rule of law, and putting the American people first. And that message is going to resonate because it's simple, it's true, and it's backed up by Trump's own actions. This pardon gives Democrats a tangible, concrete example of Trump's corruption that they can point to over and over again. And it's the kind of thing that sticks with voters and influences their decision when they go to the ballot box. Legal experts and scholars are also using this pardon as a case study in how presidential power can be abused, and they're writing articles, giving interviews, and testifying before Congress about the need for reform. Some are arguing for constitutional amendments that would limit the pardon power, though that's a very high bar to clear because amendments require 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of the states to ratify. Others are arguing for new federal ethics laws that would require presidents to consult with an independent board before issuing pardons, or that would make it a crime for presidents to promise pardons in exchange for obstruction of justice. Those reforms might be more politically feasible, especially if Democrats maintain control of one or both houses of Congress. But they're also going to face opposition from people who think they infringe on executive power. The debate over how to respond to Trump's abuse of the pardon power is going to dominate legal and political circles for months, maybe years. And it's going to shape the future of American governance in ways that we can't fully predict yet. And here's the terrifying part. A significant portion of the American public either doesn't understand what's happening or doesn't care. Trump's base, somewhere between 30 and 40% of the electorate, has been conditioned to see any criticism of Trump as partisan attacks, any investigation as a witch hunt, and any legal accountability as political persecution. They don't see Trump's pardon as an abuse of power. They see it as Trump fighting back against a corrupt system that's trying to destroy him. And as long as that narrative holds for a large portion of the population, it's very hard to hold Trump accountable through democratic means, because you need a broad consensus that what he's doing is wrong. That consensus doesn't exist right now, and this pardon is another data point in the ongoing crisis of American democracy, where we can't even agree on basic facts, let alone on whether our leaders are behaving appropriately. Let's zoom out and talk about what this moment represents in the broader arc of American history. Because we are living through a period of constitutional crisis and democratic backsliding that historians are going to study for generations. Trump's presidency, and specifically his use of executive power to protect himself and punish his enemies, represents a fundamental challenge to the American system of government. The framers of the Constitution designed a system with checks and balances precisely to prevent any one person or branch from accumulating too much power. They gave Congress the power to legislate and control spending. They gave the judiciary the power to interpret laws and check executive overreach. And they gave the president limited but significant powers, including the pardon power. But the system only works if the people in power respect the norms, traditions, and unwritten rules that constrain how those powers are used. For most of American history, presidents have generally respected those constraints, even when they disagreed with them. But Trump doesn't operate that way. He sees norms as obstacles to be overcome, constraints as challenges to be ignored, and rules as things that apply to other people but not to him. And when a president operates that way, the entire system starts to break down because the checks and balances are only as strong as the people enforcing them. So here's the bottom line, and I want to be very clear about this because it's the most important takeaway from this entire disaster. Trump's pardon scheme has backfired politically in ways that are going to haunt him and the Republican Party for years. But more importantly, it represents a fundamental threat to American democracy and the rule of law. Trump is using presidential power to obstruct justice, to protect criminals, and to insulate himself from accountability. He's doing it openly, brazenly, and without any apparent concern for the long-term consequences. Democrats are fighting back, Republicans are divided and paralyzed, and the institutions that are supposed to check presidential power are struggling to do their job. This is a crisis, and it's one that's not going to be resolved quickly or easily. The investigations are going to continue, the legal battles are going to escalate, and the political fallout is going to intensify as we head into the 2026 midterms and the 2024 presidential election. Keep watching this story, because every development matters. Watch what Congress does with their investigations, watch what prosecutors do with the evidence they're gathering, watch how voters respond in upcoming elections, and watch whether Republicans finally find the courage to stand up to Trump and say that this is wrong. Because if they don't, if this pardon stands without any meaningful consequences, then we're setting a precedent that will fundamentally change what it means to be president in America, and not in a good way. This is history unfolding in real time, and the decisions that are made in the coming weeks and months are going to determine whether American democracy survives this moment intact, or whether we slide further into a system where power matters more than law and loyalty matters more than justice. That's what's at stake, and that's why this pardon matters so much. This story is far. Judges are also paying attention to this pardon, and some of them are not happy about it. Federal judges take their role as guardians of the rule of law very seriously, and when they see a president using the pardon power to protect people who were convicted in their courtrooms, it's a direct affront to their authority and to the judicial process. Some judges have already made public statements criticizing the pardon, saying it undermines the integrity of the justice system and sends a message that powerful people can escape accountability. And in future cases involving Trump or his associates, judges are going to remember this. They're going to be less inclined to give Trump the benefit of the doubt, less willing to grant his lawyers' motions, and more skeptical of claims that Trump is being unfairly persecuted. That matters because judges have enormous discretion in how they manage cases, what evidence they allow, and what sentences they impose. And if judges are predisposed to be skeptical of Trump because of his pattern of abusing presidential power, that's going to make it harder for Trump to defend himself in court.